Arman had always been a man who carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed the world revolved around him. His tall figure always dressed in tailored suits, his shoes polished until they reflected the lights above, his watch glittering, as if it announced his success before he even spoke. And though people admired him from a distance, what they did not know was that beneath the glamour and wealth was a heart that had grown cold and arrogant over the years. It's a heart that no longer remembered the warmth of loyalty or the power of love. For there was a time when Arman had been different, a struggling man with nothing but dreams in his pocket and hope in his eyes. And in those days, it was Aliya, his wife, who had stood by him. Her hands blistered from work, her clothes simple and unadorned, her smile carrying the strength he needed to keep moving forward when life seemed impossible. She had cooked for him on an old iron stove in their one-room apartment, stayed awake with him when he worked late into the night trying to draft proposals for clients who barely knew his name, and whispered to him in moments of despair that he was destined for greatness and that she would never leave his side. And yet, as years passed and his name began to be spoken with respect, as wealth filled his accounts and luxury surrounded him, Arman began to drift away from the values that had once guided him. He began to crave admiration not from his wife but from strangers, his eyes straying to women at parties who draped themselves in silk and diamonds, women who carried the sophistication of high society that Aliya never cared to imitate. And while Aliya was content with her modest clothes and her devotion to their home, managing every corner of it with dedication, making sure he was never without a clean shirt or a warm meal, Arman began to see her as ordinary, forgetting that her simplicity was what once gave him peace, forgetting that her quiet strength was what had carried him to where he stood. Instead, he began to see her as someone who did not belong beside him in the world he now occupied, and soon enough, his path crossed with Sana, the younger woman with bold eyes and a sharp tongue, a woman who flattered him and dressed in designer gowns, who carried herself with the kind of showy glamour that turned heads at parties. And Arman, intoxicated by his own pride, allowed himself to believe that she was the one who truly matched his stature, ignoring the fact that her laughter was shallow and her loyalty only as deep as his pockets. Yet he held her hand in public as though she were a prize. All the while, Aliya endured the whispers that trickled through society, whispers that called her the cleaner wife, the woman who lived in the shadows of her husband's fame. Whispers that asked how long she would allow herself to be humiliated by a man who treated her like a servant rather than a partner. And though her heart ached with every rumor and every pitying glance from relatives who could see the pain in her eyes, Aliya remained silent, for she remembered the man he used to be and the love they once shared. And she told herself that maybe, just maybe, he would remember too. But her patience was tested beyond measure one night, when she overheard a conversation that shattered the fragile hope she still clung to. Arman's voice over the phone, low and dismissive, telling Sana that his wife was nothing more than a woman who scrubbed floors, that she would never stand beside him at a gathering because she was not worthy of being seen in society. And as Aliya stood frozen with the phone pressed against the wall, her heart cracked under the weight of those words. Tears stung her eyes, but beneath the pain something else began to stir, something that had long been buried beneath years of endurance. A flame of dignity that whispered to her that she had given too much of herself, that she had hidden her light for too long, that she was not the worthless shadow he painted her to be. And for the first time in years, Aliya felt anger not at him, but at herself, for allowing him to define her worth, and she decided in that very moment that she would no longer hide, that she would no longer let herself be a ghost in her own life. And with trembling hands she opened her wardrobe, a place where her clothes had always been simple and practical, but there it hung. A yellow dress she had once bought with innocent excitement, but had never worn because Arman had mocked her when she tried it on, laughing and saying it made her look like a servant trying to dress like a queen. She had folded it away after that, letting his cruelty bury her confidence. But tonight as she touched the soft fabric, she felt something shift inside her. A realization that she did not need his approval to shine, that she had always been enough, just as she was. And so she slipped into the dress, fastening it with steady hands. And when she looked at herself in the mirror, she did not see the woman he had belittled. She saw strength, beauty, and dignity. She styled her hair in soft waves, applied makeup with care, not to please him, but to remind herself that she could still own her reflection. And when she finally stepped into the car to drive to the party, her heart pounded with both fear and courage. Fear of the stares she would face, and courage to finally reclaim her place. And meanwhile, inside the grand ballroom, Arman was already basking in attention, Santa on his arm, her gown sparkling under the chandeliers as she clung to him like a trophy. The guests raising their eyebrows at the boldness of a married man flaunting his mistress, yet still flattering him because of his wealth and influence. Laughter and music filled the hall, glasses clinked, and Arman felt untouchable. Until the doors of the ballroom opened once more, and silence seemed to ripple through the crowd as every pair of eyes turned toward the woman who entered Aliya. Radiant in her yellow dress, her head held high, her every step graceful and steady. And in that instant, the air shifted. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Whispers spread in waves as people recognized her, some gasping aloud, others staring in disbelief. For she did not look like the woman they thought they knew. She looked like royalty, like a queen who had simply been hiding her crown. And Arman himself turned, his arm loosening from Santa's grip as his eyes widened, his mouth parting in shock as though the ground had been pulled from beneath him, for he had never truly seen her until now, never realized how breathtaking she could be. When she stood in her own power, and though pride burned in him, though shame clawed at his chest, he could not look away. While Santa shifted uncomfortably, her confidence slipping as she felt the room comparing her artificial glitter to Aliya's effortless radiance. And as Aliya walked through the hall greeting people with warm smiles, her voice calm and dignified. She did not once glance at her husband with longing or anger, only briefly acknowledging him as if he were a stranger, and that indifference struck him deeper than any confrontation could. For it showed him what life might be if she truly left him behind, and in that moment, Arman felt a fear he had never known before. The fear of losing something priceless that he had spent years ignoring, and though the night was just beginning, the foundations of his pride had already begun to crumble as the woman he had dismissed revealed herself to be the true queen of the room. The moment Aliya entered the ballroom, the energy of the room shifted entirely. Guests who had moments ago been laughing, gossiping, and raising their glasses now turned their attention toward her, whispering in awe and confusion, and while many had known her only as the quiet wife of Arman, the woman who kept to herself and lived in the shadows, tonight they saw someone different. A woman who carried herself with grace, her yellow dress glowing under the chandeliers like sunlight breaking into a storm, her presence so commanding that even those who had never met her were compelled to watch her. And as she moved through the crowd with a serene smile, people came forward to greet her, offering compliments and remarks of admiration. Some saying she looked stunning, others marveling at how they had never realized her elegance before, and, though Aliya accepted their words politely, she did not linger. For her goal tonight was not to bask in praise, but to show herself that she had always been enough. And meanwhile, Arman stood frozen, his mistress Santa still clinging to his arm, though unease had overtaken her, her forced smile faltering as she noticed the way eyes now drifted from her glittering gown to Aliya's simple yet majestic dress. And though she tried to laugh and whisper something into Arman's ear, he could not focus on her anymore. His eyes locked on his wife as a mixture of shock, shame, and an unfamiliar pang of fear stirred inside him. Fear that he had lost something far more precious than the shallow admiration he had been chasing. And as Aliya continued to walk, she passed groups of women who had once pitied her. Women who had whispered that she was nothing more than a burden Arman tolerated. And tonight those same women felt small, their words silenced by the undeniable truth before their eyes, while the men who had nodded along with Arman's arrogance now glanced at him with questioning looks, as though asking silently how he could have ignored a woman like this, and the humiliation began to settle heavily on his shoulders, his proud posture faltering as he realized that the room was not celebrating him anymore, but admiring her. And in that moment, he understood what it meant to be invisible, for the woman he had treated as invisible had become the very center of the night.
Ow.
And when Aliya finally approached a group near the center where his business partners stood, she greeted them with warmth and dignity, answering their questions with intelligence, speaking with a confidence that surprised even them. And it was then that Arman remembered the countless times she had given him advice in private, small suggestions that had helped him make big decisions. The way she had always understood his work, even when she did not live in his world. And yet, he had dismissed her contributions as nothing, taking them for granted as though her mind and heart were unworthy of recognition. But tonight, as he saw his colleagues nodding in respect while speaking to her, he realized that she had always been capable of standing beside him, that he had been the blind one, not her. And the realization cut into him like a blade, leaving him restless and exposed. And though he wanted to move toward her, pride kept him rooted. For how could he now approach the woman he had humiliated, the woman he had betrayed, while Sanaa's grip on his arm grew tighter, her voice sharp as she hissed quietly that Aliya was only trying to steal attention, that she looked cheap compared to her. But Arman did not respond, for the more Sana spoke, the more hollow her words sounded. And when Aliya finally did glance in his direction, it was not with longing, but with a calm indifference, her eyes holding no bitterness, no need for revenge, only a quiet strength that told him she no longer needed him to validate her, and that truth terrified him. For he had built his world believing she would always remain in the shadows waiting for him. But now, she was no longer waiting. She was shining on her own. And as the evening progressed, the whispers in the crowd grew louder, guests wondering aloud how Arman could have ignored such a woman, some even murmuring that Aliya looked like the true partner of a successful man while Sana looked out of place. And Sana, though she tried to hide her insecurity, could not bear the comparison, her temper simmering beneath her forced smile, until finally she excused herself angrily and walked toward the corner of the hall, leaving Arman standing alone. As eyes continued to measure him against the wife he had belittled, and the irony burned inside him, for the mistress he had paraded as his trophy had crumbled under the weight of Aliya's presence, while Aliya herself did not even need to try. And as music began again, and couples moved to the dance floor, one of Arman's senior partners, a man who had always respected him, approached Aliya and asked her for a dance, and though she hesitated politely, the man insisted with genuine admiration, and as Arman watched his wife glide gracefully on the dance floor with another man while laughter lit up her face, a deep ache spread in his chest, jealousy burning through him. But it was not the shallow jealousy of possession, it was the painful jealousy of realizing what he had thrown away, what he had broken with his own arrogance. And he stood there helpless, his hands clenching at his sides, wanting to rush in and claim her, but knowing he had no right. No, not anymore. For he had stripped himself of that right the moment he chose another woman over her and the sight of her. Enjoying herself without him twisted inside him until he could no longer ignore the truth. That he needed her, that he had always needed her, that without her his success was hollow, his world incomplete. And yet as the night stretched on, and Aliya continued to receive admiration and respect, he felt smaller and smaller, his image crumbling before the very eyes of the society he had once been desperate to impress. And when at last she returned from the dance floor and excused herself to step outside for air, Arman followed her, his steps heavy, his heart pounding with a mixture of shame and desperation. And as he found her standing beneath the night sky, the soft lights from the hall behind her casting a glow around her figure, he hesitated, words catching in his throat, for how could he apologize for years of neglect in one moment? How could he tell her he had been blind? How could he beg forgiveness when he had broken her heart again and again? But as she turned and met his gaze, calm and unflinching, he felt his pride collapse entirely, and though the words still did not come, his silence spoke volumes, his eyes pleading in a way they had never pleaded before, while she stood tall, her silence stronger than any words, leaving him to confront the reality that he might never deserve her forgiveness but could no longer live without it. And in that moment he knew that the man who once thought himself powerful was powerless before the woman he had once dismissed as ordinary. Powerless because she had shown him that true power came not from wealth or status, but from dignity, grace, and the courage to rise when others tried to keep you down. Arman stood in the cool night air watching Aliya as she lifted her eyes to the stars, and for the first time in his life, he felt small not because of money or power, but because he had wounded the only person who had ever truly loved him. His throat burned with words he had buried for years, and yet now they poured out like a flood. He told her he was sorry for every cruel word he had spoken, and for every time he had dismissed her as unworthy. He told her he remembered the days when she stood beside him in poverty, when she shared bread with him, and when she prayed for his success, even as she went hungry herself. He told her he knew she had been the strength behind his victories, and that without her, he would have been nothing. Aliya listened quietly, her face calm and unreadable, and her silence felt like a punishment sharper than anger. He stepped closer, his voice breaking as he begged her to forgive him, not because he deserved it, but because he could not imagine life without her. He said he had chased vanity and empty admiration, but none of it had filled the emptiness inside him. He said the world could praise him, yet he would still feel hollow if she turned away from him tonight. Aliya looked at him then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and she asked softly if he truly understood the pain he had caused. She asked if he remembered the nights she had cried herself to sleep while he was out with another woman. She asked if he could ever erase the humiliation she had felt when people whispered that she was a servant in her own home. Arman's shoulders shook as he admitted he could never erase it, but he swore he would spend the rest of his life trying to heal the wounds he had inflicted. He dropped to his knees in front of her, his pride shattering as gasps rose from a few guests who had followed them outside. He did not care about their stares or their whispers. For the first time in years, his image meant nothing to him. All that mattered was the woman standing before him in the yellow dress that had humbled him more than any defeat ever could. He pressed his forehead to her hand and begged once more, his voice trembling, that he needed her, that he loved her, and that he was lost without her. Aliya closed her eyes as the memories of their life together swept through her heart. She remembered the young man who had once held her hand with hope and innocence. She remembered the laughter they had shared in the small apartment where love was their only wealth. She remembered the sacrifices she had made willingly because she believed in him. And she also remembered the coldness that had replaced that love, the betrayal, the loneliness, the shame. Her heart wavered between anger and forgiveness, between the desire to walk away and the longing to restore what had once been beautiful. For a long moment she said nothing, and Arman feared she would turn away, leaving him broken forever. But then she spoke, her voice steady yet tender. She said love was not about perfection, but about choosing each other again and again, even when it was hard. She said she could not forget his cruelty overnight, but she was willing to see if he truly meant the words he spoke. She said forgiveness was not a gift to be taken lightly, but a chance to rebuild if he was brave enough to change. Arman lifted his tear-stained face and nodded fiercely, promising her that he would never again allow pride to blind him. To honor her as his wife, his partner, his equal, he vowed to show her with every action that she was the queen of his heart. Aliya finally extended her hand to him and helped him rise, and as their fingers intertwined, a hush fell over the onlookers, who realized they were witnessing something far greater than scandal or gossip. They were witnessing redemption. Arman pulled her gently into his arms, and for the first time in years he held her not as a possession but as a treasure. Aliya allowed herself to lean into him, her heart beating fast with both fear and hope. Together, they walked back into the ballroom, and the crowd parted for them, not because of Arman's wealth but because of the quiet majesty that surrounded them. Santa was nowhere to be seen, for she had vanished into the shadows, unable to face the truth that love built on lies cannot stand against love built on sacrifice. The music began once more, and this time Arman held out his hand to Aliya in front of everyone, asking her to dance. She hesitated, then placed her hand in his, and together they moved across the floor slowly, gently, as if learning each other anew. People watched with admiration, some with envy, but Aliya and Arman saw no one else. In that dance they found again what had been lost. They found trust struggling to rise from the ashes. They found hope blooming where despair had taken root. They found a love stronger not because it was flawless, but because it had survived fire and chosen to endure. By the end of the night, Arman whispered to her that he would spend every day proving that she was his queen, and Aliya finally allowed herself to smile, not because everything was healed, but because for the first time in years she believed it could be. And so the woman who once walked in unnoticed left the party with her head high, her hand in her husband's grasp, and the man who had once shamed her left, humbled, grateful, and determined to never again forget the worth of the woman who had always been his greatest strength.